Hello and welcome back. Today we will be taking a look at A War Made in Russia by Sergei Medvedev. This is part of kind of our larger, more recent focus on the war in Ukraine slash Putin in terms of books we have been reading in preparation for a charity stream on February 24th, which is the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, which will be on the gaming channel. Now, this book presents a narrative that's a little bit divergent from kind of the other books we've read so far, which is that he in the intro he leads with a bit of a quote that's a nice turn of phrase, which is something to the lines of, we are dealing less with sort of Putin's Russia and more dealing with Russia's Putin, which is to say that he kind of has this central core idea that it is Russia itself that has become more culturally oriented towards this sort of aggressive behavior vis-a-vis the invasion of Ukraine, and this was quite a bit interesting to me. This reminds me of an interesting study, and we're going to first summarize kind of the ideas of the book, then we'll get into the ratings and recommendations after that. But this reminds me of an interesting idea that was in George Lakoff's Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things book, which was a study in which people are more likely to rate another country as being more similar to theirs than theirs is to being more similar to that country. And that sounds like a little bit of word salad, but they did this study where people from the United States were forced to were separated into two random groups, so it was a controlled study, and one group was asked, how similar is Mexico to the United States? And then another group was asked, how similar is the United States to Mexico? And in theory, those answers should come back the same, because the sequencing shouldn't matter. But what the study interestingly showed is that people would give higher scores to the question, how similar is Mexico to the United States, than they would how similar is the United States to Mexico, which is to say that there is, or what the essay argues, or essay/study argues, is that there is a prototype effect, which is that we are more likely to rank and think of other countries as being very similar to ours, and this is a cognitive bias that we are going to hold. And so whenever we're evaluating another country's culture, we're likely to make mistakes because we're likely to think that their culture is more similar to our own than it actually is. Which isn't to say we're going to think that it's exactly the same, but we'll think it's more similar based on whatever evidence we have. Even if, and the framing will even cause you to rank it as being less similar. For example, we're more likely in the United States to say that Russia is similar to the United States than we are to say the United States is to Russia in terms of ranking. Okay, I thought this was an interesting kind of little bit of a thing, because this book is focused more on Russia's culture and Russia itself. And there's kind of, I think, three broad ideas in the book, maybe, as well as kind of reference to a lot of ideas that he had in a previous book, which was called The New Leviathan, I believe, which he references in this book. But that's Russia itself, is responsible, or that you are dealing with Russia itself, not necessarily Putin, and Putin is a manifestation of, the Russian culture as it stands today. The second one is that he talks about post-imperial ressentiment, which let's talk about it very briefly now. This is a bit of a philosophical term. To some degree, the text is a little philosophical and not necessarily as friendly towards the layperson, but this is a philosophical concept that has a lot of stuff packed into it, above and beyond the notion of just resentment, which is just reading the Wikipedia article, because I think this is a good explanation of it. In philosophy, ressentiment, French is one of the forms of resentment or hostility. The concept was of particular interest to some 19th century thinkers, notably Nietzsche. According to their use, ressentiment is a sense of hostility directed towards an object that one identifies as the cause of one's frustration. And this is very key, that it is directed at this notion, or that it is directed as the cause of a frustration, or in this case, the cause of Russia's decline in the context of this book. That is an assignment of blame for one's frustration. The sense of weakness or inferiority complex, another very essential element, which is not included in kind of the normal notion of resentment, and perhaps even jealousy in the face of cause, and the cause is cause, generates a rejecting, justifying value system or morality which attacks or denies the perceived source of one's frustration. which attacks or denies the perceived source of one's frustration. The value system is used as a means of justifying one's own weakness by identifying the source of envy in the objectively inferior, serving as a defense mechanism that prevents the resentful individual from addressing and overcoming their own insecurities and flaws. The ego creates an enemy to insulate themselves from culpability. And in this book, he argues that this sort of, subject of the ressentiment of Russia is the West, kind of writ large, and blames everything on the West. And so this is an interesting one. There's this notion of bringing Russia back up from its knees. That's kind of created for Zhirinovsky. Not sure how it's pronounced 100%, but basically for everything that bad happens, gets blamed on the West. And then in terms of the discourse that is allowed in Putin's Russia, because he does crack down on all kind of the open discourse. This is something that's a little bit interesting. So Putin's two predecessors, Yeltsin, who was democratically elected, or depending on how much you want to use the word democratically elected, but he was democratically elected, and Mikhail Gorbachev. These two predecessors started to open up the press and allow the press to be more critical, and notably Putin cracked down on that. But that's kind of like less in the book, but it is a part of, reforming the narrative, which is part of the book. And then finally, kind of the third main idea is this idea of authoritarianism and degradation being a central pillar of what's going on. And so, okay, let's unpack a little bit more the Russia itself idea. He talks a lot about a rewriting of history and a historical propagandizing, about how there are kind of groups that are meant to preserve kind of Russia's history have been, persecuted, and that, textbooks have been rewritten in a particular way. There is a focus on the victory in 1945 over the Third Reich, Germany in the World War, and that this has become kind of a central element. This looking back at this event has become a central element within Putin's Russia, or for Russia's Putin. And that this is a May 6th, May Day type of thing. And it is like, it's present in so many ways. So like May 6th is the Victory Day, and it's a celebration. And he talks about how the narrative of May Day used to be, never again, in kind of the times following 1945. And now the narrative has changed a little bit more towards we could do it again, and this appeal towards this war state, which is kind of happens kind of later in the book. He talks about this, and then he also talks about internal colonization and kind of the history of Russia, which like Russia, has basically more or less been at war for the past several hundred years, with kind of brief intermezzos in which it's not at war. It was at war with the Poles, the French. It was at war with the Golden Horde, so the massive, the Mongolian invasion, and the remnants that kind of stayed in, in the portion of Asia that's adjacent to Europe. This was an enemy that the Russians, or at the time the Rus, had to fight, and he talks about kind of this long historical context of being at war is a feature, which is interesting, because he also talks about how Putin appeals to history in a way that's not so fair or lucid or something like this. As far as the authoritarian and degradation goes, he talks about Russian fatalism, which is, he appeals to like this gambling with your life type of idea. He gives evidence for it. It's pretty interesting. He talks about this notion of bodies as a resource, and about how, Putin and various other people within the Russian state, Russia's a very resource-oriented country. They have a ton of oil, they have a ton of timber, this type of thing. And so there's this, tendency to perceive everything as a resource, and in that even human lives are perceived as a resource. There's like, for example, one of the pieces of evidence he uses is like the dream of propelling the population, which is around 170, 140 million. It's unclear because the census data is bad. Propelling this up to around 500 million, which like Putin in like an address, has like accidentally misspoken and said there's 500 million people in the Russia. He's also like expressed how if there wasn't the calamities of, what is it, 1917? I forget the what he blames, but he definitely blames 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. He says it's like the biggest geopolitical tragedy in history. But he says if those two didn't happen, there would be like 500,000 people. And so there's this like focus on it. And then also there's this normalization of violence. And then that occurs throughout the book, that this is a main theme. And finally, the presence of the KGB or kind of Chekist ideology, and it's Chekist referring to the initial security organization that preceded the KGB. Now it's the FSB, but it's the same idea. And so these are kind of some of the main themes. The themes that he kind of talks about in the the New Leviathan, which he references at the start of this book, are that there are 4 internal wars going on. The first is the war for space, for this kind of ties in with the history and this notion of internal colonization, in which he argues that, the UK, it colonized abroad, and then it lost its colonies, and it's very obvious, kind of delineation between the UK's colonies and the UK, but it's not been the same with Russia, because Russia's been getting around I think it was 3,500 or 35,000 square miles of territory a year since like the 1800s or something. I forget the exact number, but the point is that, the colonization of starting as the Rus or, in Europe, and then expanding all the way, through Siberia until you're reaching the Pacific coast. This was a long and steady expansion, and so what you have is this the subject of your colonization, or the subjects of your colonization and conquest, and these things are adjacent and attached to the state, and so there is a relationship not of a Republican kind of organization or a civil organization, but rather a relationship of exploitation throughout, kind of the empire, because it is an empire that is completely contiguous, which is a lot different than the UK, because the UK, its colonization was abroad, and very clearly abroad, and so the relationship was much more obvious, and it also broke down in a much more obvious way, whereas here we still have this like remnants of empire, which is definitely a theme. And he also talks about the war for symbols. This is the second internal war. He, like in this book, it gets expanded on, or it gets talked about a lot in terms of talking about the AK, the Automat Kalashnikov, the AK-47, which is like venerated as like a symbol of like Russian power. There's like a giant statue to the guy who invented it, except he didn't really invent it. He just took a German gun and then changed it a bit to make the Kalashnikov. And then also talking about, and I thought this was a little bit amusing, like a tank biathlon. So apparently there's like a biathlon type events that get done with tanks, which is interesting, but it is demonstrative of a very warlike focus on things. I talk about the internal war for bodies, which is part of the authoritarianism fixation, and in there's like a lot talking about how torture is normalized, and so it's obvious when you have like something like torture that gets normalized. We'll get to that a little bit. And then finally, the war for memory, which is this like rewriting of history in order to serve this narrative, focusing a lot on the victory of 1945, and then also moving from this never again we have this type of war to we can do it again, and we need to do it in order to to fight against the particular the target of our angst, our ressentiment in the West. And so this is kind of an interesting thing. Very quickly, we're just going to go through kind of some of the chapters, and then we'll get into the ratings. So there's 3 sections of the book: the anatomy of violence, the memory crusade, and you can see these are kind of on theme in terms of name, and the war nation. The central idea of the anatomy of violence is focusing on how the state kind of appropriates or talks about the body. The first one is the state came after the body, then back to 1937, the final diagnosis, people as the new oil, which was an interesting metaphor. Again, looking at people as resources. They talk about, in these chapters, they talk about like the brutalization of people from the police state and how in regions like Chechnya and Belarus, for the most part, the rules that are explicitly like in the Constitution that are supposed to apply to police are just not enforced, and they're effectively like lawless principalities or like feudal principalities, where kind of the more central organization doesn't care what happens there. And then they also talk about, the mobilization, and this isn't a much later chapter, but mobilization, how in the central apparatus, I think it's like 0.5% of, Moscow was mobilized in terms of fighting in this war in Ukraine. But then you have places like, heavily rural areas, or places where there's a lot of poverty, nearly 100%, or in some towns, in some cases, 100% of the male population is mobilized. And so you have this seeing and mobilizing people as a resource type of thing, and it not affecting kind of the more central apparatus in Moscow. We have the zoos of terror, and that chapter is about what's going on in Chechnya and Belarus, and a generator of entropy is another chapter. Part 2, the Memory Crusade. They have Kolyma by the Kremlin. That is a particular park, and he kind of sort of drags how Russian identity is this amalgamation of all of the people who it has colonized, and uses this to talk about kind of this self-colonization argument a little bit. The Memorial to Russian Ressentiment, or resentment. It's not ressentiment, it's spelled a little bit differently. I think he talks about this in talking about the Kalashnikov. There's Thus Spoke Zhirinovsky, which is kind of a little bit of a tip to the hat to Nietzsche, who wrote the book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But Zhirinovsky is in particular the far-right leader who ran against Putin in elections, but it's kind of like ran against Putin in elections, who Putin used to inform a lot of his ideology. But in particular, this guy, the phrase that really stuck is the notion of pulling Russia up off of its knees, that it had been humiliated by the West, and that, some sort of appropriate response, which would eventually be a hot war, was needed. And there's like another book, or another author that gets referenced in this book, rather, who wrote a book that kind of is seen as being a predictor or like of reality. I forget the exact word for that, but it is seen as being prophetic, there we go, of what's going to happen. And in that they talk about, the reclaiming of territories in particular. This is something that's like just, I think that Putin just says that, and this is not a main point of this book, but Putin just says that he doesn't like, he just says what he needs to say in order to not get intervened on, and then just kind of takes what he wants until, nothing will happen to it, or until something will happen to him. And this is kind of a point that's more prominent in Garry Kasparov's book, Winter is Coming, which we've also reviewed on the channel. But and then we have the offering made on the 9th of May, talking about May Day, kids in strollers that look like tanks, this type of thing, where there's this normalization of, this highly jingoistic or militaristic looking culture. And I think that this is a little bit important to focus on how the culture is going to be different and this thing. Now, I don't 100% necessarily, this is one book, this is one data point, right? And so this is, to some degree, you have to take things with a grain of salt and building up an overall appearance of things. But I was reminded of that study where we are very likely to make the mistake of thinking of another culture as necessarily like ours, which doesn't mean we should demonize other cultures. We shouldn't otherize other cultures, but we should reflect or recognize that they can be wildly different. And they're talking about how the culture has become militarized, especially since, Putin took office in the last 20 years. It's become much more militarized. And then we have part 3, the war nation. We have the zombie apocalypse, which he kind of says that the current Russia of today is like a zombified version of the USSR. We have the revenge of the underground man, which is talking about Dostoevsky's Underground Man and using it as a little bit of a thing. We have the Z virus. Z and V have become, and Z is right on the cover of the book, have become symbols of, kind of Russian nationalism. The author argues Russian fascism as well. And in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, there were two separate units or categorization, denotations that units took in the invasion of Ukraine. And they were for East and West, or the Russian words for East and West, which start with a Z and a V, I think, respectively, but I'm not 100% sure which one's East and which one's West. In particular, I think Z is more common as a representation of this nationalism. And, there's the book kind of comes back multiple times to the irony of the notion that the pretext for this war was been denazifying Ukraine, but in fact, the fascists are the ones invading, as well as kind of drawing a parallel between when Ukraine was invaded, and tanks rolled in before, in, the early 1900s, when it was, when German tanks, I think in 43, I'm not sure the exact date when Hitler turned on Stalin, but, tanks rolling into Ukraine must have looked very much similar when tanks roll into Ukraine in 2022, rather, nearly a century later. Then there's Russia Inside Out, where they talk about how all this brutality that was, allowed within the system, police torture is normalized, and when it becomes public, it's not even a scandal, or not even a proper scandal. And then they're showing Inside Out, what the atrocities that happened in Bucha, this is just emblematic of, the coat where Russia had all of its internal mechanisms of brutalization and violence has now been turned inside out, and now the rest of the world can see this type of thing. This is the metaphor that gets used prominently in that chapter. And next is mobilization as Russian fate. We talked a little earlier how there was discrepancy between mobilization, which is they talk about in this chapter, but also they talk about how if you just refuse mobilization, the fine is $50. And to be fair, the $50 goes longer in Russia than it would in the United States, so that frame of reference might not necessarily be fair. But the idea is that they would go to avoid the hassle of the state, or go out of fear of the state, and just not pay the fine instead. And that the resistance to mobilization was very, very small. There was wide protest in the streets, but the author notes, and this is a bit divergent from other authors like Kasparov, who are saying, hey, people are agitating for change. The author notes that the amount of people who demonstrated was only 1% of the population. It was relatively speaking small, and the amount of people who resisted conscription was also relatively small, which just seems to indicate that people are more going lockstep into the apparatus, or it is recognizing it as fate, or mobilization as Russian fate, which is part of the narrative of Russian fatalism, which is a symbol that gets talked about earlier in the book. We have the Age of the Sledgehammer, which talks about the leader of Yevgeny Prigozhin. I think Prigozhin's the last name. I'm not sure if Yevgeny is the first name, but they talk about how they executed a man with a sledgehammer for defecting, and brutally, and posted the video online. And then it talks about the nature of the brutality, as well as how Prigozhin was pulling recruits from the populations that were imprisoned, and so in exchange for amnesty, and that's part of the Age of the Sledgehammers, talking about Prigozhin and the Wagner group in Russia, and then War as a National Idea, and then the Unfinished Work of 1944. And War and the National Idea was a bit interesting because it discusses how the idea of the war is not. So a lot of people just talk about how the war is about seizing land in Ukraine and this sort of thing, and then this book sets an interesting narrative where the war is not about seizing land in Ukraine, as more as the war is an end in itself, which is very interesting. And in terms of a narrative, it's also very concerning, because what they argue is it's actually just doing a slow simmer on the population. And the whole idea is if you are going to make your population more militaristic and nationalistic, a war is a pretty good way of going about it. And so what they argue is that the real end is not this seizure of land, but it is a shaping of the population such that you can bend it to your will more easily and to make it more, militarized in general. And this was like a bit of a fascinating sort of narrative that it's the war is the end in itself. And that was really interesting to me. I'm not sure if I think it's correct. I think a large part of it is probably, restoring the glory of the Soviet Union. Putin very openly says that the worst geopolitical tragedy that's happened, I think in history, is the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I think a lot of it is restoring those old borders, but the war is, well, he's not going to publicly say the war is the end in itself, but there is this notion, and this gets talked about, I think it was in the 21 press conference, Putin talks about this, is that Russia should be an exporter of chaos, or something to this effect. And this notion that the best way that Russia can actually engage in engage in a productive way, and by productive we mean, semi-destructive through the lens of ressentiment and hurting the other who is the subject of your resentment. The way that they can engage productively in that sense with the West is by creating increasingly high tension. And I think this is what he says. I don't think he says something about exporting chaos, but he says that Russia's foreign policy is increasing tension in Western states, and that if everyone is tense and subject to kind of this this need to feel like they have to build up this sense of uncertainty, and these sorts of things, these benefits Russia. And in a sense, this is like a reverse peace dividend on your enemies. And so that was also interesting as well. But those are kind of a lot of the ideas that are in the book, and let's get into the ratings. So, for utility, I give it a 3.5. I don't think becoming more well-informed on, what's going on in Ukraine is necessarily super productive for the average person. I think that as far as politics go, if you're in the United States, I think it should be something that you care about. I think that, I forget the leader of Belarus right now. It's not coming to me, but he leaked plans for them invading Moldova after Ukraine. Putin has said a ton of rhetoric about wanting to reclaim old borders. There was some Putin affiliate who said Poland is next, but I don't know how Putin denied Poland was next, but of course he's going to deny Poland is next. And I think that, this book also discusses this, but I think it's a bit reminiscent of, appeasement with Hitler, where Hitler sees Czechoslovakia and everyone's like, oh, okay, we don't want any war. We're going to deal with you. That's fine. And then he sees the Sudetenland, I think, or Anschluss. I'm a little hazy on my World War II history. It's not that not that good. But he sees land 2 or 3 times, and no one did anything until until everyone had to do something, right? And this is just to attack Poland, and no one helped out. And so, in my mind, the people who are calling for some sort of peace assume that Putin's gonna just chill afterwards, and that it's not, and that he can be seen as a legitimate peace partner, and this type of thing. And so people who are oh, we shouldn't write Ukraine a blank check, and it's okay, maybe not a blank check. I understand where you're coming from in this type of thing. And to be fair, as far as the government goes, corruption is a problem for Ukraine, and so it maybe isn't the best benefactor. But the notion that this ends with Ukraine if some sort of peace deal is made, where Russia gets to take the Donbass and Crimea and all of that at once, the notion that it's over is very similar to Chamberlain coming back to the UK with peace in our time, I've secured it, we're just giving up the Czechoslovakia and then he's gonna stop. And it's is he? Because Putin has so far has annexed territory from Georgia, he's annexed territory from Ukraine, and he's trying to annex territory from Ukraine again. Certainly doesn't have the military capability of Germany, but that Germany did in the 1930s and 40s. But it's the intent to restore the Soviet Union seems very much apparent, and that the rhetoric that like yeah, a lot of pretext. Anyways, but back to the point of utility. I think that the utility is, to the extent that you are engaging in politics, I think that this is an issue that people should be concerned about. And this book does give some insight into that. I don't think that it's necessarily the highest utility. We scored it a little bit low. It is getting some points. It's a bit of a short read, so in terms of efficiency, it's kind of high. So, but it's... yeah, it's not prescriptive in any sort of way. It's relatively academic as a book. It's not suggesting ways in which you can get involved, like, write your representative regarding this issue being important to you, this type of thing. So, yeah, we have it at 3.5. For novelty, I have it at a 6. I thought the argument was one that was not really ever really portrayed in Western media, or not very commonly, which is that we aren't seeing Putin's Russia, we're seeing Russia's Putin. I think stapling everything on one person, all the sorts of blame, is a very simplistic way to represent stuff, and it's very, very attractive, generally speaking, when you are trying to simplify things such that people will consume it. So in terms of media has an incentive to oversimplify things and kind of create a person for whom to lay blame on. Like, in general, presidents, for example, are not responsible for everything that happens while they are in office. In fact, they don't have control over a lot of stuff, but they get blamed or given credit for whatever good or bad happens. And this is an example of this. And so on the flip side, if you're a Western-oriented person, which if you're, if English is your primary language, you probably are, then you are likely to, the oversimplified kind of answer is, oh, Putin's to blame. Or you find some sort of narrative where Putin's not to blame, but Putin's behavior makes sense. But in either case, that you are blaming in particular Putin, or blaming or denying blame to specifically Putin rather than an underlying cultural sentiment, is going to be the case. And so the argument that it's not the case, I think, is novel. And so we had it for that. Now, as far as, is this something that if you didn't encounter, this would be a big deal? Not really, which is kind of the second parameter we kind of look at for novelty. And so it didn't score high in that regard. For entertainment, I gave it a 5.5. I really didn't know what to give this for entertainment. It's always weird trying to give informative books, a rating for this. I thought that it read pretty well. It was like, it didn't drone on. It wasn't like, yeah, so it's very, even though it's written by a guy who seems very involved, like, academically speaking, it wasn't written like a stuffy academic thing. 5.5. Okay, style 6. I liked it fairly well. It was solid. Readability, I gave it a 4.5. He sometimes references things that are, I think, if you don't have a background in philosophy, might be a little bit difficult. He references Foucault, and he kind of talks about ideas without necessarily fully explaining them. It might be a little bit tough. He talks about ressentiments, as we've kind of talked about. And so, okay, I gave him a little bit of a ding for readability. Maybe I should have given him more of a ding. That's probably the case. It probably should be like a 4, but okay. And then for interest, I give it a 6.5. I thought that the subject material was very interesting. There's a lot of interesting beats. There's a lot of, like, interesting little pieces of information, especially if this is this is the sort of topic that interests you. I actually quite enjoyed this, and so I thought that it was, and it's, like, relatively short, easy to get through in this type of stuff, and so, we gave it a 6.5 for an overall rating of 5.33. And then we have kind of the quote, which I thought was interesting. We're already in the situation of the Third World War, whether or not we wish to call it that. And this is kind of in reference to the parallels between the appeasement with Germany and kind of just appeasement in regards to Russia and just kind of letting things go. As far as recommendations go, I think that this wouldn't necessarily be the first book I would recommend. If someone were to want to read a book on Putin specifically, this would not be the first book I would recommend. It would probably be Winter is Coming by Gary Kasparov, which we actually have right here. This is the book, but this book is very obviously a polemic piece, which doesn't attempt to be even-handed at all. Not that I think Putin deserves an even-handed kind of treatment, but I just wanted to note that this is just, for Winter is Coming, that's just like a hardline warning, and so I think that this book is a little bit more in-depth and a little bit more detailed. It's not necessarily the first book I would recommend for the conflict, but the notion that it is not just merely a person, but instead a cultural apparatus. I think that this notion is interesting. I think thinking about conflicts in this way is useful, because I think that very often people view conflicts as being as they oversimplify it to the extent of thinking of it in terms of just individual people. And in this book, there's like this symbiotic relationship where Putin is creating a particular kind of a culture, but that's also the type of culture that is going to create or cry for or be interested in Putin. Like the Kasparov book, which I think might be inaccurate in this way, because Kasparov was a he was part of the, not resistance, but he was part of the political factions that were adversarial to Putin. I think Kasparov over represents how much the Russian people want change and how much the Russian people dislike Putin. And I think that it's perhaps the case that they're more on board than Kasparov gives them credit for. And so and that this book is kind of an interesting unpacking of that type of notion. And so I found that was very interesting. And so with that in mind, as far as recommendations go, I would recommend this to someone who's first already somewhat familiar with Putin or what's going on in Ukraine. It wouldn't be the first book I would recommend on Ukraine. But I would also recommend it to people who are interested in the notion of seeking some degree of nuance, or an example of wanting some degree of nuance, in particular of looking at stuff from the cultural movements. And I'm not saying wholesale blame the culture or this type of thing. I think that that's incorrect as well, but there's like some sort of middle ground where it's not just all the leader, right? And I think that even if the state is totalitarian, which I think is the case in Russia, and I think totalitarian states often breed particular cultures because they're repressive, and this is a problem, but I think that would be kind of an interesting read for someone who's maybe not concerned about the war in Ukraine, but does find that type of thing interesting. And so that's kind of the lines on which I would recommend this book. The 5.33 doesn't necessarily look like super good, but it's not, the rating system, the idea I think is that I want an average score to be a 5, and so this punches up above its weight in some regards. It's a little bit kind of invokes some more technical philosophy in some spots, but it's intended to be kind of a book for a wider audience. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this book. I hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing. And other than that, have a good one.